Okay, one chat here. Okay, good. All right. So, welcome everybody. I'm really excited about the number of people that are joining us. Right at the moment, I'm just going to mute everybody because there's a lot of background noise. I will unmute Paul shortly in order to allow Paul to show us his screen. So I'd like to thank you in this strange and unusual time. I think we're seeing both the benefits and the realizing the disadvantages of being somewhat isolated and finding other ways to stay in touch with people. I myself have organized all my photographs, cleaned out filing cabinets, and so it's actually not been all that bad. So Paul Webster is with us from Calgary. Paul is a good friend. We've known each other, I think, since 1993, when we met at the first Amethyst camp. And Paul is a lifelong student of the game. He just keeps learning more and more. And one of the best things about Paul's learning is that he's willing to share it with us. Paul is an Olympic and team leader, Olympic coach and team leader to the men's national team, to the Olympics and to the World Curling Championships. He's also with High Performance Alberta and runs the high performance program at the Glencoe Club in Calgary. So I'm going to pass, and as well joining us is Kyle Paquette. I'm going to see if I can figure out how to get Kyle so that we can hear him without hearing everybody else, but I'll work on that. Kyle is a national program consultant with Curling Canada. Kyle has a specialty in sports psychology. I believe Kyle is a PhD and with a specialty in sports psychology. And Kyle is joining Paul tonight. So Kyle, I can't hear you at the moment, but what we're going to might have to do with you, Kyle, is have you raise your hand in the chat box or put something in the chat box, and then I will unmute. But with the number of people involved tonight, we just really need to keep everybody else muted. I will also keep an eye on the chat box. Paul has just messaged everybody that he's got his cell on, and I'll keep an eye on the chat box too. If you have any questions during the session, please use the chat box. We'll try to open up the mics partway through and then again at the end for any questions or discussions. So what was that last one? Okay. I could ask everyone to mute their mics, that's true. Not everybody has that capability, I think. So I'm going to start right now just by passing the presenter role. And there's Paul. Paul, take it away. Thank you.
Okay, I'll assume everyone can hear me. Just again, thanks to Curl Ontario. They seem to be leading the charge with these online seminars, and who knew it was going to be the way of the world as we are now. So we'd planned this one prior to the wheels falling off the bus in the world, but I think it's apropos that we're going to use this format. So I just want to say thank you to Andrew for reaching out and contacting me. It was interesting because I was in the middle of a debrief with a few teams at this moment. We've sort of sped up our season. And one of the first people I reached out to once I knew I was going to do this was Kyle. So I'm happy to have Kyle, and we'll figure out how to unmute him. But I'm going to introduce Kyle. Kyle, can you hear me?
I'm going to unmute everyone else just at the moment, Paul. If you could, up at the top of your screen, everyone, there's a little microphone in a bubble. If you click on that, you should be able to mute yourself, and then so that we don't have to mute everyone. So let's try it. So Kyle?
Yeah, perfect.
Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's great to be able to participate in this. I appreciate the invitation.
So I'm going to introduce Kyle, so we can actually call him Dr. Paquette now. So Kyle's been with curling. I know, isn't that great? So Kyle's been with Curling Canada for, I don't know, 10 years now, Kyle?
Yeah, it's been almost 10 years.
Right, and we got our hands on Kyle before, as he was in his master's and applying for his doctorate. And I think when you hear Kyle speak today, if you've never heard him speak, you'll realize right away that he totally knows both his education, but our sport as well. And there's no one better, I believe, to give another insight into debriefing than Kyle. He's got some really cool insight both with our able-bodied program and also our wheelchair program. So that side of picking athletes as opposed to athletes that just form their own team, which is something we don't deal with, but there are some probably college and university coaches in there that would be into that. And I just want to, and again, having been at the last Olympics with Kyle, he's got some really good experience there, both good and bad, with us moving around and bouncing around with our mixed doubles team. Kyle, myself, and Jeff were supporting those guys in their quest for gold and their achievement of gold. And then also with his work with Rachel Holman's team as well. And then behind the scenes a little bit more these days with our wheelchair program. So again, I just want to thank Kyle on behalf of everyone for joining us today. Thanks, Kyle. To the participants, we've asked you to mute, but what if you can, as the chat box, I can see the chat box on my screen. If you can give us a sense as I begin this presentation of just your name. I can see your name, and most people have it properly written. Just the type of team, so the age and stage of team that you're coaching, and if you have a key question today. If it's looking like I've totally ignored your question, I've put my cell phone up in the box there. So 403-837-3727. So you can also text me. So feel free and keep that cell phone handy if you want. But then we want to make sure if we have some key questions. So we'll keep doing that. So intro's over with, and as you introduce yourself to me, that would be great. And I'll get on to, so I'm going to keep my screen like this so everyone can see my screen, and then I can see the chat box as well. So again, here's my cell phone number. Everyone usually asks during these, at least the last couple, if we can get back to them and share the presentation. I promise you the entire presentation, I will send it to Andrea in whatever format she needs. But then there's also my email address there that you can also email any questions, or if you need any resources, please contact me there. So where to start? I have to admit to you, in the midst of talking about debriefing, we hadn't had a presentation put together, so I thank Andrew for this, about how to debrief. We've actually got debriefs put together and formats put together for our teams, but I think this is something we can work towards and really find a resource for some of those coaches that either haven't done this in the past or are looking for a little bit more help. Because I know this was not one of my strong suits when I started. 9 times out of 10, where we want to start as a coach is we want to get right into the coaching season and get into that and talk to our team. And then the fun stuff isn't the stuff at the end of the season where we want to go over every single thing that happened and make it better. One of the things I think we need to press into these teams and ensure they understand is the way to get better is not to simply change teammates. I think if we look at our top teams, Brad Gooch is a great example this year. Even Carrie Anderson's team is a great example after not having a great year last year. Identifying that they actually have four players that are championship caliber, and then working on fixing those gaps. And we'll talk about gap analysis, but also wanting to improve. Our best teams, if you look at our championship teams, are the ones that stick together. And I think so many times in our B+ teams around there, especially in the adult leagues, everyone's looking for that secret sauce, and what they're looking for is that just changing a teammate. And we see these player rotations so many times where they believe that's going to make them better. And I would totally encourage either the player or the coaches there is really press upon these athletes that a serious 4 to 8 year plan with a team that's all going to be working towards the same goal and actually identifying the gaps and where to fill them, is going to be a team that's actually going to succeed. There's not too many teams that get together that win everything the next year, but there are a ton of teams in our midst that get together, assume they're going to win everything the next year, don't, and then change at least a teammate, if not two teammates. So I put together some steps in the PowerPoint as you can see it. So step one, just finalize next year's team. If it's the same one, perfect. If you're adding or taking away teams like Rachel Holman and Kevin Cooey did in the last few weeks, get that done as soon as possible. And then number two, which I think is super important these days as our season becomes longer and longer, take a breather, including the coach. So the majority of the coaches out there don't get paid a lot, if anything, to do this job. I think it's super important from a professional and family standpoint that the coach is allowed to take a breather, as well as the players. They need to focus on their professional lives, but also their family lives. But then set some dates of when this stuff's going to happen, so they're not surprised when it happens. It's always part of the season process. This year, if we look at the silver lining of what's happened, we're able to start this process much earlier. So our breaks are happened in March, since the start of March almost, and then we can start this, so we don't have to worry about the Players' Championship or the Championship Cup, or unfortunately the World Championships this year. So this process is just starting with a number of teams. It's going to get, I think, started with a whole bunch of teams in the next 2 to 3 weeks, now that everyone realizes that it's for sure over. But that allows us to speed up this process as well and take advantage of the time off. We don't have ice, but the ability to actually have people on Zoom or join meeting here or Skype is kind of increased now that we everyone's sort of forced to their homes. So there is a silver lining to this, is that so we can debrief a little bit more with our team. So step number 2, let them take a breather. 3, gather all the data, and I'll get into that. 4, decide on the format, and we'll talk about a few. I've already alluded to the one that I enjoy most, which is gap analysis. Create your debrief data collection, and that's really where your job as a coach is going to come into play. You can brainstorm a little bit with your team, but take a lead on this if you can, because we want to sort of create that tunnel for them, as opposed to collecting way too much data and asking too many questions. Number 6, collate that data into one document if you can. And then where we're here tonight is that process of debrief and talking about it. Have I missed anything so far, Kyle? I'll assume Kyle can hear me. Okay, you might be away.
Yeah, I haven't muted everybody, so I think.
Yeah, Kyle's got 2 little kids too, so I can feel he's up there. So I'll get into it.
I can hear you great, Paul. Good job.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, welcome back. Okay, so data, and we talked about the objective data, and that's where we'll start. It's sometimes easy to get, especially for our men's and ladies teams. A little bit tougher for some of the junior teams. But gather it all. And if you have that one player on the team, and there usually is one that is the numbers teammate, have them included in this process. So gather any and all data, whether it's statistics, analytics. We have Renee Sonnenberg working with our national program now, both as a coach, but she's also taking the lead in our analytics gathering, and has put together some really cool tools for our national teams that we can compare ourselves against, both Canadian teams and world teams, and just see where those statistical gaps are, whether it's scoreboard management or percentages. Win-loss record, and it's up to you. I've given a couple examples after that about how you want to split that win-loss record up. I don't think it's an accurate format just to do an overall season. So give me some ideas of looking at our record against teams that we should have beat, teams that we need to beat. You may choose to split it up into win-loss record at key competitions as well. So whether it's preseason, sort of pre-competitive Bonspiels, and then competition season being sort of provincial to national to world competition, it's effective to actually break that down. It's also effective as coaches. We talk about splitting the season up into measurable week format. we want to see that curve go up. So, looking at that win-loss record from September, October into November, December, and then January after, into that competitive season would be an interesting one as well. And again, we want to see it ramp up. Winning 100% of your games would be amazing. But more importantly, as we're trying to work on things, trying to see how we're improving throughout the season is also important. Because there's a number of our teams in the pre-season where we know we're trying to work on, whether it's scoreboard management details, strategy situations, where the objective is not to win the game. The objective is to work out a few questions, answer a few questions, possibly raise a few more questions, but then move into so the win-loss is not important there. And then points, and more points at the bottom. Everyone seems to have their own point system these days. I'm just going to grab that up here in a second. So grabbing what you need from those point systems. I've used CTRS and Order of Merit, assuming there's men's and ladies teams. But then I know a lot of the junior leagues in Alberta, we have the Alberta Junior Curling Tour. So that's an important one for our junior teams. We always pull that one up when we're working with junior teams here and just see how their points are there, if that was a focus for them. Some of those older junior teams don't focus on the junior tour and want to play more men's and ladies. But in those in that 15 to 18 year range, a lot of times the focus is that junior tour. So we can pull some pretty cool data just out of how they're doing in those events. So again, step number 3, just grab the data and then boil it down to what questions you want to ask. So in that debrief questionnaire, when we're actually asking the questions, pull out some key questions from those stats for sure. And then Kyle's going to talk in this one, but we had a great conversation this morning about what is significant when you're getting that data. So I'm going to turn it over to Kyle just to get into what his thoughts are on this one.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. So this idea of significance, I think it's interesting when we start to look at sort of the qualities of a successful debriefer. It really is a role that has certain skill sets that are, I would call them prerequisites to being able to facilitate effective debriefs consistently anyways. But definitely one of them is this ability to collect and interpret data. And I think sometimes that's easier said than done. In fact, there's a huge discipline on data collection and qualitative research where the focus is just primarily on reflecting on the validity and the reliability of data that you collect and the interpretations that you make of the data. And I don't want to go into too much detail, but there's two types of error in science. And these two types of error come up a lot when we do debriefs. And number one is when you have data and when you interpret the data, you see or you think that something is significant and you act on that when it's actually not significant. And this can cause a lot of frustration. I've been in the room oftentimes where you have somebody who's dead set on the fact that their third isn't making enough draws or hits, or their second's not making enough run backs. They have one piece of data to substantiate that, but I like to use Moscow's rule, which is one time it could be a fluke, twice it could be a coincidence, 3 times you start to see a trend. When you actually have a trend of data, then you can actually start to be more comfortable with the reliability of that data. The other type of error is when you believe something is not significant when it actually is, and as such you discount something that could be in fact a difference maker. Again, I see this often with people who do self-reflections in preparation for debriefs, where they have blind spots and they really try to protect those blind spots and protect their identity by discounting so much of the data. Of course, the problem is that creates a significant gap in their learning, and it really it harms their development in the long run.
Thanks, Kyle. And again, I think when you listen to Kyle, I know every time I listen to him speak, I learn something more. And I think Andrew hit it off the top, talking about just that constant quest for learning. I think it's important for coaches. One of the best courses I've ever taken, and I encourage you to do that, was just currently this past season through the Alternative Dispute Resolution course here in Alberta. So it's ADR Alberta. Now there's ADR associations in each province. And they did a lot. It was all about conflict resolution. And the first course is just about talking one-on-one, and the second course is more mediation, because I wanted to get better in this arena in terms of talking both individual athletes, but also to mediate teams. Then one of the questions I asked later on this presentation is that question is, you might be better to actually bring in a third party to mediate, but then also teach yourself a little bit better as a coach to mediate. So I would encourage you, I know in Alberta, there's a lot of grants for these courses. I got 2/3 of it paid for by the government of Alberta. That was last year, maybe not this year. But, you know, I had a question. Dolores actually asked a question before we move on about the debriefs are very different depending on whether the season was a good one or a bad one. After the bad season, she says, there's so much more emotion involved. And that's what cued me onto this thing. And I agree, Dolores, the emotions are the big part of it. And, you know, and that's where we talk about that objective data, but then Kyle will bring in later on and talk about just now, but the subjective piece is we can't ignore it. And sometimes that's the biggest piece of data in the room, is not all the numbers and all the answers and coded questions, but the feelings of the emotions. And we have to boil it down. If there's 4 players that cannot play together, and that just may be one piece, it might be a 2 and 2, then we've got to either figure out if that works or if it doesn't. And sometimes that's a tough question as a coach. We can't get into details, but you can imagine with some of the questions being asked by some of our national teams recently about player changes, but you're also talking to the team, you're also talking to the player that might be removed from the team. And then there's some crazy questions going on there. Everyone's trying to win, and there's different levels of that depending on the age and stage. Like I said at the start, I think my biggest thing is trying to figure out 4 players to begin with that we get along with. But we can't ignore that human factor that personalities do play a part. Curlers are so close-knit on the ice and off the ice that I have no option but to include my teammate in my shot in a 4-person game. So I need to figure out how to do that. And then, you know, dealing with men versus women is a whole different ballgame too, in terms of how those emotions and personalities play a part. So that's a really good question. I think, you know, getting that third party might actually help. I always tell, you know, this team I'm working with in Ontario right now, you know, when we talk individually with those players, just say, if there's some tough questions to ask, let me ask them. Because I'm not going to be with that team in a day in, day out process when they're at competition. So if there's someone that they need to dislike, better be me asking those tough questions and pointing fingers than someone else. And it's super important to have that person, because we can't ignore the personality stuff, or just sometimes the things that aren't being done. And we need to be able to ask those tough questions and not just say, you know, we need to win more games. So format, and the majority of people have, you know, different professional lives where they've done these type of formats. So stop, start, continue is a very easy one. What I like about stop, start, continue, it's a great one for junior teams, especially some of the younger junior teams, where we can brainstorm some things that we simply need to end that aren't working well. Some things that we've seen that we know we need to do, we haven't started, but let's get going. And some pretty good things that worked for us last season that we need to continue. So the continue factor becomes planning ahead of how those things are going to both stay at the level that we had this season, but also work on to improve them. The start things are those easy sort of low-hanging fruit, if you will, that we've seen, we've known we have to do, but now we also have to create a plan to change that and work towards that. And then the stop things are also kind of those low-hanging fruit ones where we all kind of know that we shouldn't be doing certain things. Whether it's one of the easy ones is just jumping a rock, whether it's sweeping before the break point, little things like that where we've talked about it. But now we just got to put it on the table and just put a big red stop sign on that one. Gap analysis is the one we use primarily with our national teams. It's a process that both Kyle and I have worked towards, and I actually really enjoy. It's an evolutionary process too, because the process that we've set up can change. We can have some similar questions asked year to year, but we can also add in some team-specific questions as well. And I'll show you a little snippet of that format. We can't share the entire thing, but we can show some of it. SWOT analysis, just another one. You know, what are some strengths in our team? What are some weaknesses? What are some opportunities? And what are any threats to our success? And then it's an interesting discussion about just identifying those ones. And then our preference, again, my preference personally for the older junior teams and adult teams is that gap analysis. Because what I think when we identify those key gaps, it then sends us on the same path really to ensure that we can actually then start making a plan to not only identify the gaps, but then make a plan to improve those gaps. So we're actually trying to win. In our gap analysis with the national teams, I've changed some of the titles, but here are just a few. So there's about 11 there that I put on there of different areas, and each of these key performance areas have a subset of questions with them. So delivery, shot making, and I like splitting those out if we can. Sweeping management, curling practice as opposed to just general practice, and we sort of separate practice and training. Off-season training, which is going to be even more important this year. In-season training, mental training, and then we get in some team questions where scoreboard management as a team, shot selection, because we don't, and then team dynamics. What I like about putting the scoreboard management, shot selection as a team area is we're not trying to point fingers at the skip. And that is one thing we need to identify in our sport, is that we need our younger teams especially to understand that the skip is going to carry out a team plan as opposed to his or her own plan. Now, they have some skips will tell you that's exactly the opposite of what they're thinking. But if we can get everyone working towards a collective understanding of scoreboard management or a collective understanding of shot selection, when a mistake is made theoretically, if the skip calls a shot, or whether it's a top 4 foot when we're tied without hammer in the seventh end or whatever it might be, and everyone steps back and doesn't say a word, a lot of the times I bring up that question about, so the skip made a mistake. We collectively supported him when we didn't say a word. That type of thing becomes a team area, and making sure that people know that scoreboard management and shot selection strategy are a team concept is an important step for that development. Andrew, you have a question?
Yes. Are mid-cycle changes a new trend at the competitive Olympic level? Why or why not?
Yeah, it's funny. It's not really a debrief thing. I'll admit I have a pretty good insight with Kevin Cooey's team. I work with them on a weekly, daily basis here in Calgary. I think what you're seeing, we just got into the first year of our cycle of points to qualify for the Olympic trials. So what these teams are identifying, so we had a couple big, 4 or 5 probably big changes out there when you think about it, that all had domino effects on other teams. What they're seeing now is that they're looking towards that Olympic cycle. So we have one more competitive season before the trials, which is next year. These teams aren't concerned right now, the teams that are in question anyway, about winning the trials, qualifying for the trials. What they're trying to do is to figure out, do they have the 4 people that are going to not only get to the trials, which I know is achieved pretty much for both the 2 big teams that we saw, but also they want to go in there and win, but also the team that's going to win at the Olympics. So we don't have to ignore the fact that we didn't win a medal both in the women's and men's at the last Olympics. All of our teams are recognizing that they need to have crazy talented teams from skip to lead. And it's interesting, people like, if we talk about Cooey's and Homenstein, people like Colton Flash and Lisa Weigel are going to be snapped up, and Lisa already has, by other really, really good teams. It just didn't seem to work at that point. And I liken it to the fact that, and it's sad, don't get me started about the NHL, but I like the fact that it's a team that's leading the standings kind of, or top 2 in the NHL standings right before the trade line, and makes a trade for another top line centerman or winger, what it is, because they're trying to put that team over the top. And I think what you're seeing right now are those teams recognizing that they didn't feel, based on performance or whatever criteria they put in there, that they had and decide to make a change. The tough thing with curling is that it becomes personal because they make the teams all by themselves. And there's a lot of finger pointing and questioning, where in a professional sport where there would have been a general manager or a coach make that chance, there would have been questions on that person, but the players themselves would have been, would not have had to answer questions about why. We don't see that side of the NHL, but we do in curling. So, are they a mid-cycle new trend? I don't think it's a new trend, but I think, these teams, it just sort of happened that both teams wanted to make a change in it. And it kind of happened at the end. Once they knew at the end of the season, then everyone made it now. I know Holman's team took a lot of flack on social media because it looked like they're using the COVID-19 stuff to sort of mask this media release. Well, it was far from the truth. If you realize all the dominoes that were falling, because teams are talking right now, if you don't make it and there's a player out there that you want and they already form a new team, you might have missed out. So anyway, that was a sidebar, but thanks to Rahul for that question. So back to the gap analysis, and then I picked just delivery for some questions. So some of the subcategories, and you'll see the format in the next one, is just line of delivery or hitting the broom, consistency of release, ability to vary rotation release, and so on. You can read those. This is a questionnaire that we had for some of our top teams. I would challenge some of those younger coaches, when you look at these subcategories, to ask those questions, because what's going to happen in the format of the Excel spreadsheet that we use anyway is that each player is going to grade themselves, and you can pick the grading system that you want, but they would grade themselves, for example, on line and delivery, hitting the broom, with 10 being, the top category, 1 being probably shouldn't curl. Consistency of release, ability to vary rotation release might not be things that we, ability to vary rotation, for example, would be something I would probably take out for a junior team. But the rest of them can pretty much fit from a junior team to an Olympic caliber team. And then it's interesting, we just do individual and team, but you could, as a coach, even separate and do one for each of your teammates, and then it'd be up to you if you wanted each of your teammates to compare each of his or her teammates. I like just doing a team quotient, because then the coach is going to know a little bit better individually. And then this would be an example of what that looks like. So there's the individual score, team score, and then I think the comment section is probably the almost the most important part, because we want them to, if there is a 10 or a 1 or a 2 or something, we want them to give some ideas of why they're thinking that, and push your teammate to do that, because we get a little bit subjective in those comments. But like Kyle alluded to earlier, sometimes those objective comments can be the most powerful. So we want to see, especially, sometimes a skips team score, if it's about ability to hold, hitting the broom, which is back on the previous slide. And personally, individually, I put down a 9 out of 10 for my accuracy, if you want to call it that, in my skip. Has the team score at 6, and just says, Paul is always tight in his intern. We've never talked about this. Now we've got something to talk about. So this is all I would say, the easy stuff so far. Creating the tool and stuff can be a lot of work, but it's getting all that data and gathering it. Then we get into some of the tougher stuff later on. Now this is where it gets a little tricky, is just collating that data. I'm not the Excel genius. Kyle's definitely a lot better at it, but everyone usually knows someone in their midst that is, and if you give them the questions and what you're looking for, they can create this format that either asks the questions, collates, and so on in one document. I would encourage you to do that. This shouldn't be a manual process if you're having numbers assigned. But then we want to make sure you can do it that way, but then the comments are going to be up to you. So gathering those comments. So a couple of things here. To begin your meeting, I said I like celebrating the achievement. So now we get into talking about what things are actually going to be talked about. Don't ignore the really, really good things. I think it's really important, knowing that we just went through a season, to actually move through and talk about, guys, here's whether it's stop, start, continue, or here's all the 9s and 10s. Let's talk about all the 9s and 10s. Because if this is the second time you've done it, you're going to recognize that some of those 9s and 10s were 4, 5, 6s last year, maybe even 1s and 2s. And we've made some huge strides we kind of set those aside at that point, though. But I think it's always super important to start these meetings with what have we done really, really well, or what have we improved so much that now we're doing them really, really well. So make everyone feel really, really good, right? And then we're brainstorming the key items we need to work on. A lot of teams are going to have a whole bunch of 6, 7, 8s, but we know we need to make them 9s or 10s to achieve any of our goals. We then need to boil it down, and I say that in the presentation, to achievable items that can happen, and again, separate them. So spread those out into timelines. So what can happen really, so if there's some fitness items. Yeah, I will zoom in. There we go. Let me know, I'll just ignore your questions for a bit and put this on the screen. There you go. And then move this out to the side. And then you can see that better. So now you put those items on a timeline. And I would encourage you, depending on the age and stage of your team, to either do this with the team if they're older or a little more mature junior team or an adult team, or do this before as the discussion item. So things that you think should be done in the next 1 to 3 months, they can choose maybe the top 2 or 3 items. We do need to make it achievable. So we can't have a list of 42 items that we're going to be working on next 1 to 3 months. But we can have 2 or 3. And then, then we can go back to that list later on and possibly grab another one if we've achieved things. Anything you want to add there, Kyle, before I keep rambling on?
Yeah, no, I just want to, first of all, I think touching on a couple points here on this slide that I quite like. So the first one is how you like to celebrate some of the achieved norms and maybe some of the goals or the objectives that have been accomplished. I think that's fantastic. And just to give you a little bit of rationale, or everybody listening, and although this is probably quite intuitive, it's really important in those rooms where you're asking the athletes to be quite vulnerable in their sharing of information or in receiving the feedback that they're about to hear. That only becomes successful if you can create a safe space, one where you can actually help to monitor and shape the sort of moods and the attitudes and the states of the athletes. So starting off by getting everybody kind of leaning in, I think, is a really important first step, and hoping to keep them in that same space is equally important. The second piece I just want to mention is that last bullet about boiling it down to achievable items. I think a lot of people, that probably is a common pitfall that I see, that teams who choose to do debriefs on their own, there's a few pitfalls, but one of them for sure is that they try to do too much in too little of time. And the problem is it just becomes sort of too many sort of scattered resources. You can't really spend enough time to make any one thing get better. So on that point, one last piece here, just because you're talking about maybe taking advantage of some of the strengths of the team. There was an interesting study that was conducted about 40 years ago in Stanford, where a professor asked a group of 100 students, he provided them all with a midterm mark. And obviously, when you get your marks back, the first thing you usually look for, especially if you're a high performer or a high achiever, is you look at your worst mark. So for half the class, the professor said, I want you to spend the next semester focusing on bumping up that worst mark. And for the other half, the professor said, I want you to focus on just maintaining the other marks and don't worry about the one that's not so high. And sure enough, after the last class of the semester, he looks at the marks, and the students who focused on trying to bump up their worst mark, sure, they were able to find a marginal gain or increase in that one course. The problem is it came at a deficit to the other 4 courses. And the other group, they actually showed increases all across the board. And this study has been replicated dozens and dozens of times, and it focuses on the fact that we have to really prioritize our effort and attention because we have limited resources. And it also emphasizes the importance of taking a strength-based approach.
Okay. Thanks, Kyle. And then we get to step 6, is where we're sort of talking about, which is actually the debrief. And I think the toughest part of it, and I think Kyle hit it on the head, and I don't want to ignore that that advice he's given. And that's to, ask yourself if you're the right person to lead the debrief. There could be a really good parent who runs meetings a lot. There could be someone in your midst who is a mediator who could help. I think it is important if someone has the idea of what curling is and how it works. But this process isn't rocket science. If you, as a coach, can lead the actual data collection and collation, and then have someone in to meet and lead the actual discussion, well, I think number one, and I think this is super important. I had a meeting with the team just the other day, and I promised them it would start at 6, and I also promised it would end at 7. So I only did an hour, and then we set another meeting. So set a meeting, set an agenda, and also stick to your timeline. That commitment for the meeting is important, especially these days. Making sure people know when and how it starts and almost what format. It was also something I should put in there with all the different formats. Who knew Zoom was a thing until the last couple of days? The agenda, I think it can be a working agenda that we're trying to get through a number of meetings. But again, recognizing that these athletes have curled and spent a lot of time during the actual season. So trying not to do a massive meeting all at once. I think in this world of social segregation that we're in right now, doing smaller chunks is going to be more achievable. If we can do this in person, this could be a full day in a boardroom, and it's really effective and really powerful when I can look my teammates and other coaches in the eye. I find I did a 3-4 hour meeting for work the other day online and truly hated it. And so I didn't find it effective. I found myself getting distracted. So work with the technology, but understand it is different than meeting face to face. And then the timeline, like I said, I think it's super important to stick with that. Ron just asked a question that we'll address before we move on. Is it a good or bad idea to meet with players individually prior to a team meeting? I don't think it is. I think it's a good idea, Ron. I think it's important. I think what happens, especially with some of the younger teams, is they, and some of the adult teams, there might be whether an anxiety thing there or intimidation factor where they're unsure about how to bring certain things up in a meeting. And they might, if you have them one-on-one and just say, is there anything you want me to bring up in this meeting? And let them know you can make it yours. Sometimes you've got to empower those younger athletes to say, you know what, I know what I was going to say is going to make it mine, but I think this is super important that you actually say this out loud. Because we need these teams to become better working units. And a lot of those really difficult discussions, sometimes are really more powerful when it comes from a peer. There's always those teams where 3 of the 4 are gung-ho on whatever it is. Let's pick practice. 3 of the 4 are gung-ho on practice, and they get out exactly what they said. There's a team practice log online somewhere, and 3 times a week for 30 minutes, and they've checked off the drills that they're supposed to do. They're using technology, and then the other player every week, it's like, listen, guys, I got it once, but this happened, and this happened. If that isn't nipped in the bud, because the majority of coaches would have already identified it and talked to the athlete. But if we can sit around a table and say, listen, guys, Kyle, you haven't been practicing, and it's been frustrating. It shows now that we gather up all the data in the stat sheets. We committed to this as a team, pre-season, post-Christmas. It didn't happen maybe for 3 weeks after Christmas. Now it didn't. So, again, encouraging and then also setting that platform where the discussion can be positive. And because we're working, if Kyle's still on my team, I don't want him to give reasons to get off my team. I want to say, listen, how do we actually fix this? Because I want you on my team and I want you to become better. And therefore I want our team to become better. And I think that's one of those where the mediator can help sometimes, is asking those questions and then also teaching people how to ask questions and listen. Because on this next, let me get back to the PowerPoint here, is that art of facilitation. I'll let Kyle talk to this a little bit. But the one thing I put a whole bunch of stuff down there that was in my mind, but I'll let Kyle lead it. the one thing that I want to share from that course that I took was just that act of that whole art and science, a little bit of active listening, and that quotient. I would almost take take my team and teach them how to do that. And I said that in the screen there is showing them how to active listen, how to ask questions to their teammates when something difficult is put on. There's so many times, and honestly, I have 4 kids at home, and I'm homeschooling them right now, which is amazing. And so, yeah, and if you know me, I might be pulling out my hair right now. But then I talk to them all the time about listening to learn, not to respond. And we say that probably 10 times a day in our houses. Listen to learn, not to respond. And that key part of that debrief session is so important. So many times in life, but even in these things, we're so passionate about a subject. I'm just waiting for my teammate to stop, and I'm going to jump right in there and tell them how much I know, good or bad. And so encouraging that environment in a meeting where all 4 teammates and coach can be really comfortable about saying things. They know they have time to actually explain things, express it. They get questions from their teammates that show that the teammates care and want to learn a little bit more about what they're saying. And it's not just instant finger pointing. So before I jump into anything more, I'll let Kyle talk about this, because honestly, when I hear about art of a facilitator, Kyle's probably the best in our business at it.
I appreciate that, Paul. So there's so much that you said that I just want to touch on. Hopefully I can get back to some of it. And I just want to maybe I'll just start here by saying that I've spent the last, I've been really privileged, I would say, to be able to spend a lot of time in the sport of curling with a lot of fantastic coaches, world-class coaches, and outside of curling and other sports with a lot of world-class coaches. And one comment that Paul said earlier that I just want to maybe bring up again is that despite being world-class coaches, I would say very few of those coaches are actually well-equipped or well-positioned to be great facilitators of debriefs. And in my 10 years of research and coaching development and coaching effectiveness, I appreciate all of the different skill sets that go into being a world-class coach or an effective coach. But there are many skill sets that an effective facilitator has that coaches don't necessarily have the opportunity to refine or to practice on a regular basis. I think the other piece that becomes really important, and I just want to re-encourage maybe some reflection here, is your role best suited to be the facilitator, or would you play a better role in actually being a participant in the debrief? In my experiences, you can't be both. So I've often, depending on the relationship or the proximity that I've had with certain teams, despite them asking me to facilitate debriefs, which I often do, there have been certain situations like after the 2018 Olympics where I was clear with the team that I wanted to be a participant in the debrief and not the facilitator of the debrief, because I wanted to make sure that all of my perspectives and insights were sort of shared on equal weighting with the other athletes and the support staff. So just to jump back, I guess, to this slide here, the art of the facilitator, I would say really it starts with understanding that a good debrief, it's not something that just happens on a one-time basis. In my experiences, the teams that are most successful at debriefing, it's because they have a culture of learning. It's almost a culture of debriefing where really the emphasis, they're in the deep end of learning, and the emphasis really is this pursuit of mastery. So when it comes to debriefing, it's not like this is something that's being thrown in once or twice a year and everybody's expected to participate and it's expected to be this, revelational sort of practice. I think it's also a culture that is sort of in the deep end of ongoing reflection and open communication, where they're not just accepting of feedback, but they're seeking feedback. So their relationship with feedback is quite productive. The skills for debriefing for me, again, that facilitator is such an important word. And I think so many of us, there's a big difference between a coach and a facilitator. There's also a big difference between obviously a facilitator and an instructor or teacher. A facilitator is one who really has this ability to approach the conversation with this genuine interest and care for everybody's opinion, because everybody's opinion matters. and they're not coming to the table or into the room with a message that they're trying to deliver, but rather they're understanding that the actual meat of what's going to come out of that debrief is going to be sort of co-created by everybody who's participating in the session. So it's about sort of taking everybody's opinion and putting it together to create these understandings that are going to help support the ongoing development and performance of the team. I think facilitators, they ask extremely relevant and timely questions. They have a tremendously high degree of emotional intelligence. I can't stress this one enough. That emotional intelligence serves you extremely well when you're often engaging in debriefs, like Paul said, about a day in a boardroom. I know given some of the current realities, that's not going to be possible this year. In my experiences, though, with the teams that I'm working with on a full-time basis, whether it's in curling or outside of curling, for me, a debrief is usually about a day and a half. And prior to that day and a half, there are going to be individual meetings, actually quite a few of them, and there's going to be a requirement that the individuals have preparation work. I want to make sure that when people get into the room, they're getting into the room having already done the majority of the reflection, so then we can engage in a lot of critical dialogue together. But in those rooms, having the emotional intelligence to be able to actually monitor the states of the athletes in the room, to make sure that you constantly have your finger on the pulse of the energy so that you can help direct the energy in the way that's going to keep balance. With learning, it's interesting. We only learn when we find that there's a break in our sort of internal harmony. And this is a really important, I guess, understanding when it comes to actually just learning theory. When things are going well, we have no need to learn. But it's when in those moments of dissonance or disjuncture where we are forced to stop and figure out how to proceed. We can either use that as an opportunity to learn, or we can just kind of turn around and go the other way and reject it. So we're trying to create this dissonance. We're trying to create this discomfort in the athletes. The problem is too much discomfort and too much dissonance is going to often lead to people who just kind of are dejected and they just shut down. So it's a matter of finding that sweet spot, understanding what the emotional sort of symptoms are, and trying to hold the team there for as long as possible. It's like you're trying to thread that needle, or it's that balancing act, and it's extremely delicate, but when you get it right, you're really going to optimize the time spent together. I would also say the art of the facilitator involves a high degree of empathy and genuine care for the people in the room, and maybe more so care for their pursuit and care for their objectives as opposed to just care for the people. They're able to create safe spaces, so psychologically safe spaces, as I mentioned before, where everybody's opinions matter. And maybe most important, they're willing to be vulnerable, and they're able to manage the vulnerabilities and the discomfort, the emotional sort of, I would say, the emotional yin-yang of that debrief room. It's going to be a bit of a minefield when you're conducting effective debriefs, and you're going to have to be able to manage the emotional tone and the emotional texture of where the conversation goes. And a lot of us, we're not comfortable seeing people be uncomfortable. We have a whole bunch of coping skills in those moments. We don't like necessarily pause or dead silence. I remember I was in a room with Team Q, and the reason I feel comfortable sharing this is because I think this was actually in the newspaper. This was back maybe 5 years ago, but I remember one time there was a question I was put on the table. I forget the nature of the question, but all I remember is that there was a pause, a silence for, it must have been 15 minutes of silence. And I'm being absolutely serious here. There's no exaggeration. 15 minutes of silence, to the point where we all just started laughing. But I was not going to let them off the hook. I was not going to let them escape that sort of emotional space that we had created. And I think that's really important. We don't want to give people an out in those moments necessarily where we're on the cusp of something great, and then we jump in accidentally and we lose that learning opportunity. So going to just a couple last pieces here on the slide, and one thing I will say is that last piece, or the second last piece, reframing. The idea of being able to listen to a statement. I always find it such a challenge, an exciting challenge, I guess a privileged challenge, when you're sitting in a room and you hear a skip or a third, and they say something that is extremely harsh to a teammate. And you know the intention is not harsh, but the way it's worded is so harsh. And now you have to find a way to reframe that to ensure that the meaning and the intention behind the comment is well received. That is a skill set. It's really important having an understanding of the individuals in the room and having, again, an understanding of what their intentions are by having those individual meetings in the lead up to it become really critical. So I'm going to stop there, but I'm really open for a lot of questions on those specific sort of topics and concepts.
Yeah, so keep those coming, guys. I think it's important to, I'm going to address a question from Dick Henderson. He asked a question, do debriefs for the support groups of teams also occur, for example, the parents? Dick, I think that's a great thing. And the junior teams especially, I think, see this a lot of times, where everyone has the best intentions forming the team. And to pat the parents on the back in our awkward sport of curling where teams have to be formed, a lot of times when their kids are younger, the parents are doing that connection and with other parents and forming the team. And they put it out there. Now, if there isn't a parent coach, there's a different sort of dynamic there. If it's an outside coach, there's also a different dynamic. I think it's totally acceptable and almost encouraged that you do discuss with them after the season if things went well or things didn't go well. I remember one of my most effective coaching tools to deal with parents when I was behind the glass coaching junior teams was a pair of headphones. And sometimes I would have music on them, sometimes I wouldn't. I would just have them in my ears and just focusing. I was laughing, but honestly though, just focusing on, because there's so many times they're like, hey, why are we doing this or what's going on? And you know what, there's stuff being worked on. If we look at the product on the ice and what's happening with the kids, they're doing really good things. Are they winning? Maybe not. But we need to address what's, again, those gaps, right? Or the key items that we're working on. As well-intentioned as the majority parents are, they love their kids just a little bit more when they're winning. And if things aren't going right, my intention has never been when you're working with a group, especially of young athletes, to say, listen, we're guaranteed winning the province. My intention when working with a group of young athletes is, and I'll promise the parents, is that group of young athletes will twofold get better as individual athletes and get better as a team. Hopefully that's enough to achieve the goals that we've set out, but it might not be. But we need to get those parents on board and getting them understanding what their roles. Some of the best things, we do need stats. I don't find myself an effective watcher of the game, if that's a term, to both take stats and watch the game. I always write sort of copious pages of notes as I watch the game and circle things I want to key on. So if I have a curler as a parent, I will definitely give them the role of saying, here's the stats, but I'll sit down with that parent and say, this is how I want the stats kept. So I don't want them to pad anything. I'd rather be a 60 or 70% team that we totally realize the stats are true than an 80 or 90% team where we all look at each other kind of after some of those prior games this year and go, oh, okay, I didn't know I threw 100%. But getting those roles, I think, are important. But debriefs to the parents are super important. One of the things we used to do here in Alberta when the teams won the junior provincials, and it wouldn't be a debrief, it would almost be a briefing before they went to nationals. I would sit down with the parent group. And we've also done this with, depending on the timelines, with our Olympic parents and support groups, depending on who's at the trials when they win, and sit down and say, listen, here's what's going to happen, and here's your role. You're off to go on a vacation, and your son or daughter is going to curl. Those are two separate things. And giving them, but also letting them know the roles, how they can access their athlete, and so on. So there's numerous things. And sometimes we drop the ball as coaches and administrators in terms of what we promised and what didn't deliver. So that debrief with the parents and say, listen, there's some things I need to improve on. It could be communication. It could be access to your player during the provincial championship. I said you would, and then I tightened up the ship and you didn't get to see your son or daughter, whatever that might have been. But I think that open discussion is probably the most important thing, is making sure that.
Oh, we lost you, Paul.
Hello?
Oh, there you're back. Okay.
Okay.
Good.
Sorry, guys. I think it's an important thing, but I think that's a great question for Dick to ask, and just to understand that, the team is bigger than just sometimes the 4 people on the ice, and sometimes those parent groups can take an athlete or a team off the rails with what's happening behind the scenes sometimes. So addressing that is
You're gone again, Paul. I'll text him just to let him know.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah. Are your kids using up all your bandwidth?
I think they might be. So honestly, it's amazing. We have so what I'll do, I know we're getting to timelines anyway. We promised we're looking at an hour, but if anyone has any other questions, I would encourage you to ask them now. I know here's one great. How do we approach debriefing when we did not complete the provincial due? Yeah, that's a great question. The COVID-19 debriefing. Jeff, that's a great question. I think we need to look about how we approach everything up to provincial. The unfortunate part is if you're possibly losing a player, that's going to be a really key point. I do think it's important end to the season to debrief how things. We also need to understand that these players are hopefully going on to play again. So those individual key parts of that debrief can't just be the team that's going to be playing together next year. I think it's an important part for you as the coach to sit down with that player if they are leaving the team, to work through it, and just almost like a teacher does, going from grade 4 to grade 5, and say, here's what you did really well. Here's what you need to work on, but then also help that player with that plan on how that's going to be approached. Now, if it's a full team, even better. It sucks, honestly. We have so many teams out there that were dialed in to do their best ever provincial, national, world championship. I don't know if I've ever felt worse for a team other than Team Einerson right now, who was off to their first Worlds as a team. But there's so many out there that had the same situation happen. So we just need to recognize that, but we can't ignore we can talk about it, but we do need to understand that the season next year is still happening. And again, we mentioned this at the start of the presentation. There is a silver lining to this situation right now. We have time in our hands, and we have, like Kyle said, it would be ideal to have a day and a half all in the same room, but we don't. So how do you separate this debrief process into some manageable chunks of time, and then use these processes? So this join is an opportunity, Zoom, Skype, but working with each other to work that. Before if there's no other questions, and Daniel Schretz said he'd email me questions, please do, guys. So paul@curling.ca, and I'll make sure I chime Kyle in with that too. He's got some great angles on things. But I think the number one thing is that Kyle pointed on, I want to point out, it's if you're not the coach who's a great facilitator, you don't have to be, but be the coach who puts together all the data, makes those questionnaires, and then finds that right person who can run that meeting for you. So it is a safe, healthy spot. We want to create the situation where debrief is something that players and coach look forward to attending, not look forward to ending. And I think it's super important. And I said this to a team the other day, and I think it rhymes true. If we're going to put the time in, we need to put the work in. And that's on your shoulders as the coach before this debrief, is to not just check off a list that we debriefed and nothing comes of it, but that we check off that a really solid debrief happens. Now we got to put the work in to ensure that the identified gaps that we've found, we're going to create a key plan. And again, another role of the coach, put a plan in place to ensure that we're going to try to achieve that, but then a plan in place that ensures that we come back to that and see how we're doing. So that constant check-in is super important. So I'm going to end there. Kyle, if you have any final words, I'll let you end off everything. And everyone, if you want to email, or my cell phone's on the chat list as well, And again, I'll get Andrew to send out the presentation to you whenever she can. So I'll finalize this with letting Kyle have the last word.
That's very kind of you, Paul. I appreciate that. I would say that, one of the roles that I've been playing in the last couple of weeks with a lot of the athletes who are preparing for the 2020 Olympics in Tokyo, now the 2021 Olympics, is really trying to help them find opportunity in the challenges and the adversity that we're facing. And I do think, I really do believe that not necessarily having the opportunity to connect in person, but doing it online does come with a lot of distinct opportunities. And I do think one of those great strengths is that you can start to create a culture of debriefing where rather than sitting in the room with your team for half a day or 3/4 of a day, you can schedule maybe 4 or 5 one-hour meetings each week. So for a period of maybe a month, you can have these ongoing debrief conversations, and the conversations start to create a little bit of that sort of culture piece where this team now connects on a more regular basis, and it's something we do in stages as opposed to just once in a while. So I will just end by saying thank you so much for the invite to play a small sort of a supporting role here. As per Paul, if there are any questions to come my way, please feel free to either send them to Paul. He just put his email, or I'll put my email down in the chat message. I'd be more than happy to reply to any and all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you both very much as well. The webinar is being recorded, and so in the next few days, I'll send out the recording of the webinar along with Paul's slide deck to everybody, and I'll copy both Kyle and Paul on it, so you'll have their email addresses if you need to contact them with any questions. Paul, I have another favor to ask. Do you have an example of a gap analysis? If not, I do, that I could attach to the email.
Yeah, I think if you attach the one I use all the time is our national team program stuff. So I shouldn't send that copy out.
I have one then that I'll send out along with the recording and the slide deck. And we'll send the slide deck out as a PDF. So please remember that this is for your use only, that it's not to be shared widely. So use it with your teams if you want, but please respect that a lot of work went in by both these individuals to doing up this webinar tonight. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for being so quiet in the background. I don't think we had a whole lot of interfering noise, and that was excellent. So stay well, stay home, and stay safe, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.